I was hired to be a silent shadow in a billionaire's mansion, but I quickly realized the only thing I was actually being paid for was to take the fall for a massive, organized scheme. When the lights went out and the armed men breached the walls, I discovered that the 7-year-old boy I was protecting was the only one who held the key to destroying the man who framed us. I never expected to find myself in a mansion that smelled like expensive mahogany and cold indifference. My name is Elias, and for the last 5 years, my life was defined by iron bars, gray uniforms, and the absolute silence of a cell. When I stepped out into the real world, I didn't have a resume, a contact list, or a reputation, except for the one I'd left behind in the dirt. I was just another man trying to outrun a past that refused to fade. Arthur Sterling was different. He was the kind of man who owned half the city's skyline, a billionaire whose presence made the air feel thin. He didn't care about my background check or the gaps in my employment history. He needed someone who knew what it felt like to be ignored, someone who didn't need a conversation to know when to fade into the wallpaper. He needed a nanny for his 7-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a ghost in his own house. Since the accident, or whatever the official reports called the tragedy that took his mother, the boy hadn't spoken a single word. He sat in the middle of a playroom filled with toys that looked like museum exhibits, staring at walls with eyes that had seen too much for such a small frame. Sterling was desperate, not for a caregiver, but for a silent sentry. He offered me a salary that could buy back my dignity, provided I kept the boy quiet and secure. I didn't ask questions. I was in no position to. The first few days were a study in alienation. I moved through the halls like a shadow, watching Leo from the doorway. He was observant, far more than any child his age should be. He knew when I was watching, and he knew that I was different from the polished nannies who had quit before me. They were afraid of his silence. I understood it. Silence isn't empty. It's a vault. And I knew how to guard a vault better than anyone. Everything changed on Tuesday. Sterling had been acting strangely, his phone buzzing incessantly with encrypted messages. He spent his evenings locked in his study, pacing behind heavy oak doors. I noticed the security team lingering near the perimeter, men who didn't look like simple bodyguards. They moved with the calculated tension of people involved in an organized scheme. There were rumors floating around the household staff about Sterling's business dealings, talk of offshore accounts and dangerous associates. I kept my head down, focusing on the boy. Leo had started drawing. Not pretty pictures of houses or sunshine, but intricate, jagged maps of the estate. He would draw circles around the basement vents and the service elevator. He was mapping the house, not as a home, but as a cage. It was raining, the kind of torrential downpour that makes the world outside look like static. Sterling had left in a hurry, leaving a note on the granite counter about a business emergency that would keep him out until midnight. He'd warned me, "Do not let anyone inside, under any circumstances. If the perimeter is breached, don't try to be a hero. Just take the boy to the panic room." I had never seen the panic room. I didn't even know where it was. At 9 p.m., the lights flickered and died. A total blackout. The mansion, usually bathed in artificial light, plunged into a suffocating darkness. My instincts, honed in places where shadows were your only protection, flared to life. I reached for Leo, who was sitting in his playroom. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He just looked up at me and pointed toward the hallway. There were voices, not the shouting of intruders, but the hushed, disciplined tones of professionals. Someone was inside the house, and they weren't here to rob the safe. They were looking for something, or someone, far more valuable. I grabbed Leo, wrapping his small frame in a blanket, and moved toward the service stairs. I could hear footsteps climbing the main staircase, heavy and rhythmic. I reached the landing, intending to hide in the servants' quarters, when I heard the distinct, chilling sound of metal clicking. They were checking their gear. They were armed with illegal weapons, the kind that weren't meant for a simple home invasion. I ducked behind a velvet curtain, my breath catching in my throat. Through the slit in the fabric, I watched as the hallway illuminated with the beam of tactical flashlights. 3 men stepped into view. They weren't burglars. They were cleaning crew sent by someone far more powerful than Sterling, and they weren't here for the jewelry. One of them pulled out a digital scanner, moving it along the floorboards, whispering about the shipment and the packages with the substances that were supposed to be hidden somewhere in this floor's architecture. I realized then that Sterling hadn't hired me because he wanted a babysitter. He had hired me because he knew someone was coming for him, and he needed a sacrificial lamb to distract them. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just as I prepared to slip into the crawl space behind the wall, Leo reached out and touched my hand. His skin was ice cold. He pulled my ear close to his mouth, his voice a raspy, unused whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "They aren't looking for him, Elias," he breathed. "They're looking for what he buried under my bed." I froze. A floorboard creaked directly behind us. A shadow stretched across the wall, a man standing right behind our hiding spot, his weapon raised, the cold barrel pressing firmly against the base of my skull. The sensation of cold steel against my neck was a language I hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered it perfectly. It was a promise of finality, a reminder that my life was worth exactly as much as the hand holding the weapon decided it was. I didn't turn around. I didn't breathe. I just felt Leo's small hand tighten around my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a child who hadn't spoken in months. "Slowly," the voice behind me whispered, a rasping, clinical sound that had no room for mercy. "Drop the boy. Turn around and keep your hands where I can see them. If you twitch, you're just another casualty in a night of bad luck." I didn't argue. I set Leo down, keeping my body between him and the figure behind me. As I turned, I saw the man. He was dressed in charcoal tactical gear, his face obscured by a sleek, black respirator mask. He wasn't a common thug. He carried himself with the calculated grace of someone trained by a service of internal security. He looked at me not with anger, but with the hollow detachment of a man checking off a list of inventory. He nudged me toward the playroom door with the tip of his weapon. "Where is the override code, Elias? We know your employer keeps it on his person, but he's currently indisposed at the airport. You've been the shadow in this house for weeks. You tell me where the floor safe is, and maybe you get to keep breathing." My mind raced. Sterling wasn't at a business meeting. He had set this up. He knew this group was coming. He knew about the illegal gear they carried, and he knew they would tear his house apart looking for the stash he'd been hiding. He hadn't just hired me to watch his son. He'd hired me to be the fall guy. If the internal security team, or the rival group that had intercepted them, found the packages with the substances, they needed someone on site to take the blame for the organized scheme. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "I'm just the help. Ask your boss." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He reached out to grab my collar, but Leo stepped forward. The boy, who had been a ghost for so long, stood tall, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the intruder hesitate. Leo pointed to the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It was a massive piece of mahogany, the pride of Sterling's collection. "It's not in the floor," Leo said, his voice clearer than I'd ever heard it. "He keeps the key in the rhythm. You have to wait for the strike." The man turned his head toward the clock, momentarily distracted by the child's eerie precision. That split second was all I needed. I didn't think about the risk or the potential for a massive, life-altering charge of obstruction. I lunged. I shoved the intruder with every ounce of frustration I'd bottled up during my years in the cell, slamming him into the heavy oak bookshelves. The weapon clattered to the floor, skidding across the polished hardwood toward the hallway. We scrambled, but I was faster. I grabbed the weapon. It felt heavy, cold, and entirely too familiar, and leveled it at the man as he struggled to regain his footing. But he didn't reach for a backup gun. Instead, he started to laugh, a sickening, bubbling sound that filled the room. "You think you're saving him?" the man wheezed, pointing at Leo. "Check the boy's pockets, Elias. Check what he's been drawing for the last 3 days. You're not the bodyguard. You're the delivery system. The contents aren't in the clock, and they aren't in the walls. They're pinned to the boy's undershirt." I looked at Leo. The boy's expression didn't change, but he slowly reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, vacuum-sealed plastic bag containing a substance that glittered under the moonlight, filtering through the windows. It wasn't just a small amount. It was enough to guarantee anyone in this room an enormous, multi-decade sentence. My blood turned to ice. Sterling hadn't just used me as a decoy. He'd used me as a mule. He had been feeding me information, making me the prime suspect in his organized scheme. And now that the intruders were here, they were going to kill us both and leave the evidence on our bodies to clean up the crime scene. "We have to go," I whispered, grabbing Leo's hand. But before we could reach the door, the front entrance of the mansion exploded. A flashbang grenade tore through the foyer, blinding us with white-hot light. I heard boots, dozens of them, thundering across the marble floors. It wasn't the intruders. It was the internal security team, and they were here to secure the scene, not to save us. The man I'd been fighting grabbed my arm, his voice dropping to a desperate hiss. "Listen to me, ex-con. We're both on the wrong end of a hit. If you want to survive the next 10 minutes, you don't run from them. You run into the basement vault. It's the only place in this house they can't breach without losing their leverage." He pulled a key card from his vest and shoved it into my palm. Then he looked at Leo, his eyes filled with a terrifying, sudden fear. "The boy isn't who you think he is, Elias. He's the reason Sterling hasn't been arrested yet, and once you see what's behind that vault door, you're going to realize that you were never hired as a nanny. You were hired as the next patient." I didn't have time to process the madness. The footsteps were at the top of the stairs, and the sound of suppressed gunfire echoed through the vents. I looked at the basement door, then back at the intruders flooding the hallway. I realized with a jolt of pure horror that I had no choice. I kicked open the basement door and dragged Leo into the darkness, but as the door swung shut, I saw a shadow emerge from the stairwell, someone I recognized instantly. It was Sterling, and he was holding a device that looked like a remote detonator, staring at us with a smile that contained absolutely no humanity. The click of the detonator in Sterling's hand sounded like a thunderclap in the confined space of the basement landing. I shoved Leo behind a steel pillar just as the upper floor erupted in a controlled, deafening blast. The ceiling groaned, dust and debris raining down on us, obscuring the hallway. I didn't wait for the smoke to clear. I grabbed Leo's hand, his fingers icy and trembling, and sprinted toward the hidden door identified by the key card. My lungs burned. Every step felt like running through quicksand. We reached the vault, a massive circular door of reinforced alloy that looked like something out of a high-security prison block. I pressed the key card to the sensor. It flashed green, the gears grinding with a mechanical scream before the door swung inward. We collapsed inside, and I slammed it shut just as the heavy, rhythmic pounding of boots echoed against the steel. The room wasn't a panic room. It was a laboratory. Banks of monitors glowed in the darkness, flickering with live feeds from every camera in the house. I saw the aftermath of the explosion. The intruders and the security team were buried in the rubble of the main foyer. And there, standing amidst the chaos, was Sterling, dusting off his tuxedo as if he'd just stepped out of a casual dinner. "He's watching us," Leo whispered, his voice steady for the first time. He walked over to a terminal and began typing with the speed of a systems architect. "He doesn't want the substances back, Elias. He wants the data. My mother didn't die in an accident. She was the one who built the internal algorithm for his organized scheme. When she tried to go to the internal security investigators, he wiped her out." I watched, mesmerized, as the screens shifted. Leo wasn't just a child. He was a prodigy, a ghost in the machine. He had been harvesting information from Sterling's private server every night, using the drawings as a way to hide encrypted code in plain sight. He hadn't been waiting for a savior. He had been waiting for the exact moment the house's defenses were lowered so he could broadcast everything to the authorities. "You need to connect this drive," Leo said, pulling a tiny black flash drive from his sock. "It contains every offshore account, every signature for the illegal shipments, and proof of the attempt to frame you with the substances. If you plug this into the main uplink, the internal security investigators will have enough to put him away for the largest, longest, most absolute term possible." I grabbed the drive, but the lights in the vault turned red. A synthesized voice filled the room. "Unauthorized access detected." The air began to hiss. The room was pumping with a sedative gas. Sterling's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with a cold, aristocratic amusement. "Did you really think the nanny would outsmart the house, Leo? You're a bright boy, but you're still a liability. And Elias? You were always meant to be the one holding the bag when the authorities arrived." I felt the room tilt. My limbs grew heavy, leaden. I looked at the terminal, then at Leo, who was beginning to sway. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't go back to a cell, and I certainly couldn't let this man use a child as a scapegoat for his life-destroying greed. I crawled toward the uplink port, my movement sluggish, dragging myself by my fingernails. Sterling's footsteps echoed outside the vault. He was walking toward us, savoring the kill. I reached the port, my vision blurring, and jammed the drive into the slot. I slammed the enter key with the last of my strength. "Upload 100%, the computer chirped. Suddenly, the house's security grid flipped. The sirens stopped, replaced by the chaotic sound of heavy-duty vehicles screeching into the driveway. Flashing lights bathed the windows of the room, visible through the integrated monitors. The internal security investigators were here, and they had the data. The vault door hissed open. Sterling stood there, a look of confusion on his face as he stared at his phone, which was lighting up with hundreds of notifications. He didn't even see the team of agents rushing past him. He only saw his empire collapsing in real time. I watched from the floor as they cuffed him, his face twisting into a mask of pure, impotent rage as they read him his rights for the organized scheme and the mountain of charges piling up against him. Weeks later, the world was a different place. The story of the billionaire who used his own child as a shield made global headlines. The evidence Leo had gathered proved my innocence beyond any shadow of a doubt. I wasn't just a free man. I was a witness, a protector, and finally, someone who didn't have to look over his shoulder. I stood on the balcony of a small apartment, watching the sun rise over the city. Leo was inside, finally laughing at something on the television, a sound I never thought I'd hear. He was going to a school for gifted children, and I was going to finish my degree. The past was behind us, buried under the rubble of a mansion that no longer existed. I breathed in the fresh morning air, letting the silence settle in. Not the silence of a vault, but the silence of a new beginning. We had walked through the fire, and for the first time in my life, I was finally, truly in control.